Hi, my name is Lynn Porter, and today we're going to look at a program about managing behavioural problems. Now, I've called it Managing Behaviour Problems for a particular reason, and a lot of adults that I've worked with young people with challenging behaviours, have come at it from the point of view of trying to control those behaviours. And the truth of the matter is that the only behaviour we can control is our own behaviour. Most of these young people are totally out of control of their behaviours, and we cannot control their behaviours. What we can do is we can understand those behaviours, we can understand the reasons behind those behaviours. And when we've done that, we can manage those behaviours. And so we give that young person the experiences where they can grow and learn to control their own behaviours and have the confidence and self-esteem to be able to do that. So that's the approach that's going to underpin where we're going with this today. I've taken the liberty of including some photographs that I did from a series some years ago on cheeky monkeys, just to illustrate a few points in our programme. So first of all, I think that what we need to understand is that behaviour is learnt. We need to look at the experiences that that young person is having, that young person has had, and see where they've learnt that behaviour. And very often, this is actually from home or from school or from peers themselves. Hopefully not inappropriate television programmes and game console games, although that can be a source of some very disturbing behaviours in my experience. But it's looking at giving them opportunities to experience and therefore learn that are better outcomes for better behaviours. Behaviours can be divided into three categories. We can have an appropriate behaviour or an inappropriate behaviour, and we need to focus on the appropriate behaviour. We can have an acceptable behaviour or an unacceptable behaviour, and again we need to reward and focus on the acceptable behaviours. And then that paves the way to having desirable behaviours, which again we need to reinforce so that they learn those behaviours rather than undesirable behaviours. And an essential part of the HEP behaviour programme is empowering adults and young people to be able to put those opportunities in place. Behaviour is a barometer of the emotional state. Very often young people, and same with babies, they cannot express what is wrong with them. They haven't got the understanding and they haven't got the language skills to be able to say whatever that is. So the only way they can communicate that is through their behaviour. This goes down to the point lower down the list. Behaviour communicates information about that person's needs. So by observing behaviours, we can look at those behaviours as the barometer for the underpinning emotional state that's behind that. Behaviour is always purposeful in a social setting, and we'll find young people behave very differently at home to how they behave in school, and their behaviours will be very different in the classroom to how they'll be in the playground or on the sports pitch. So what we need to do is to observe those behaviours in different contexts and see what purpose those behaviours are achieving, what needs are being met in that young person. Behaviour is chosen to a certain extent. A young person can choose, we can all choose our behaviour to meet what we need in that particular situation. And the choices that we make will be based on what we've learned, on the experiences that we've had. As I said before, behaviour is a form of communication about our needs and how well or otherwise those needs are being met or not. This is important. Behaviour can be changed, and this is the root of what we're going to do in our HEP behavioural management programme. Behaviour can be taught. It can be taught through experiences that empower that young person to understand that they can get better results through better behaviour, and that's where our focus is. As I said, behaviour is purposeful in a social setting. So one of the important things that we need to show young people in our lives that are challenging us through those behaviours is consistency in the experience that those kind of behaviours create. Because in many of the cases that I've worked with and supported with, that young person is in control of that situation through not controlling their behaviour. Let's look at some of the behavioural conditions, like, for example, ADHD. That's a very popular one at this time, isn't it? And about 1 in 5 young people at the moment worldwide are presenting kind of behavioural symptoms that would lend itself to a diagnosis of ADHD, that's attention deficit hyperactive disorder, or sometimes ADD, attention deficit disorder. Now, one of the things that's important to know about this is that ADHD and similar behavioural conditions are not diagnosed like a medical condition through a blood test or a scan or whatever. It's actually diagnosed by a checklist of behaviours. So this is a tick list. Does this young person do this in this sort of situation or do that? And this is not, in effect, a medical test, but a behavioural checklist test. And this is how young people are being diagnosed with these conditions. And more people are receiving that diagnosis, which is a whole other argument. What is interesting from this is that behavioural symptoms can be misdiagnosed. And there's some recent research from Australia that shows that, in effect, 1 in 3 diagnoses are inaccurate. In other words, that young person has presented some behaviours on that checklist that would be consistent with how they diagnose these behavioural conditions. But there are other reasons for that. There are about 90 different physical conditions that mimic the symptoms of ADHD, for example. If those young people have got dietary problems, they may well have had some head injuries, they may well be in an environment that is creating those kind of problems. That would be a physical reason for them to have those behaviours, and they do need to be checked for, and they do need to be eliminated before a diagnosis can be made, particularly before any kind of prescriptive medicines are allocated to that young person. So, depending on the checklist of symptoms presented, a diagnosis is made. And here are some of those examples of a diagnosis. So, for example, something called ODD, or what's known as Oppositional Defiance Disorder. And this is a diagnosis based on a child's pattern of disobedience and hostility and aggression towards their parents, their teachers, other adults. They refuse to follow commands or requests by adults. Often easily annoyed, lose their tempers, argue with adults, refuse to comply with rules, directions, and always blame others for their mistakes, never accepting responsibility themselves for this. So, oppositional defiance disorder. Well, according to Douglas Riley in The Defiant Child, 1999, these are young people who tend to live in a fantasy land where they can defeat all authority figures. They're optimistic, fail to learn from experience. They have that attitude that you must be fair to me no matter how I treat you. They seek revenge when they're angered. They need to feel tough. They feel that you will run out of moves with them eventually. They feel equal to their parents and their teachers. They copycat the behaviour of some of the least successful peers around them. When you ask them a question, they usually answer with, I don't know. And their logic completely revolves around any denial of responsibility for the choices that they make or their behaviours. Another category is antisocial behaviours, and of course we hear a lot about those in the media today. And this includes expressing defiance with teachers and other adults and exhibiting aggression towards their peers. They experience increasing peer rejection due to their poor social skills and their aggression levels. They're likely to misinterpret their peers' behaviour as hostile. They lack the skills to be able to solve social conflicts themselves, often resorting to aggressive physical actions rather than verbal responses. And they, again, accept no personal responsibility for their actions, and they tend to blame everyone around them for what they're doing. So, antisocial behaviours then. Obviously there are a lot of implications for this, especially for the family and the environment in which these young people are operating, for the parents, of course. Conduct disorder is defined usually by more aggressive and dangerous symptoms, where there can be a lot of violence exhibited towards other people and animals, deliberately harming animals, threatening others, fighting sometimes, and even using weapons, cruelty, stealing, vandalism, fire setting, lying, and violation of rules. Very often truanting is involved and running away from home. So a very extreme situation. And very often what can happen with conduct disorder is that those symptoms actually overlap with other kinds of behavioural conditions, and it can get quite complicated at this stage to be able to work in any kind of consistent format, because these young people they're all their own individuals, and they will present these behavioural symptoms in different ways. This is why it's so important to focus on each individual in terms of putting a behavioural strategy in place so that they can learn more appropriate behaviours. We're now going to look at a different section, again an increase in the population of young people being diagnosed with autism. And this is what's called a spectrum disorder, so it's very individual to the person who actually has that. No two people who have autism, as I said, will behave in exactly the same way, but they do tend to exhibit certain difficulties in common, for example, with communication, with social development, with interacting with other people, with their interests and their behaviour. This includes not understanding sometimes what's being said to them, being unable to understand jokes, finding it very difficult to read body language and facial expressions. They have difficulty associating and making friends, that don't cope terribly well with new situations, and also find problems in understanding other people's feelings. They often drift off into their own space, they don't hold eye contact, and they may also resist affection and can be very overly sensitive sometimes to sensory input, for example tastes and touch and sounds and colours and so on. Another condition is OCD, or obsessive compulsive disorder. And in children, this is usually anxiety related, and it's sometimes linked to a deficiency in a brain chemical, serotonin, and this is the one that makes you feel good about things. It can include unwanted thoughts, ideas, urges, impulses or worries, often running repeatedly through their mind. And this might be about harming themselves, harming a loved one, family member perhaps, worries about dirt and germs being unclean, fears that certain activities have not been completed properly, a need for certain things to be in specific places and positions, and there could be problems if it's moved, or have to be done in a certain way before other activities can be undertaken. They might have blasphemous thoughts, fears about losing things, harming things, repetitive rituals like counting. And interestingly, there are usually feelings of panic associated with OCD behaviours. Now again, they can be very complex, very individualised for the person concerned, and can overlap with other kinds of behavioural diagnoses. The interesting thing about this overlap is the feeling of panic associated with OCD behaviours. There is another form of autism which is becoming more and more diagnosed now, which is called PDA, pathological demand avoidance. And this isn't typical of a young person you might expect to find on that autistic spectrum. What they do have is an anxiety around any expectation that is made of them, and what they will do is they will develop some very clever diversionary tactics to avoid those kinds of expectations being placed upon them. And this is, quite a difficult behavioural structure to support, really. Other forms of behavioural conditions are something called attachment disorder. And sometimes children fail when they're little to make that bond, that all-important bond with their mother after birth. This can be due to actual physical separation, or it can be because the mother is not able to interact fully with her baby's communication, often because of something as simple as postnatal depression. Not that that is simple, of course, but another type of mental health issue, like depression, for example, can cause that bonding process to be compromised. Someone with attachment disorder can have a tendency to form very controlling, possessive and abusive relationships in the future. It's interesting, in working with adolescent boys with attachment disorder, very often they can form attachments to female teachers which can develop without an awareness very rapidly into a very manipulative and possessive kind of relationship. And they can become very territorial and show the related behavioural issues around this. This isn't addressed at this stage. This young person can then go on, and in future relationships, the cycle can continue because they can be very controlling and sometimes very violent relationships. Okay, so we need to look out for where that kind of controlling, possessive and abusiveness actually comes in, and look at supporting, providing experiences for that young person to move through that. Historically, the journey to defining these conditions and the descriptions around them has been fraught with misdiagnosis. An example of that has been in what we now define as ADHD. And just historically looking at this next slide, you can see that it's always been there. People have always recognised it, but it's had different labels attached to it. And with those different labels come all kinds of understandings and misunderstandings about how we work with the young people who are presenting those kind of behaviours. What's interesting now, of course, is that we have what's known as the DSM. It is the Physician's Bible, called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. We're, interestingly enough, going to get a new version of this come out soon. And these list, quite categorically, the kind of behavioural presentations or symptoms, if you like, that would constitute a diagnosis of a particular behavioural disorder, similar to the ones that we've been looking at, although we've only just touched the tip of an iceberg there. What is a frightening trend is that the diagnoses are extending to include really psychiatric labels that go alongside normal things, development behaviours like terrible twos and shyness. And of course this does pave the way to even more overprescription of some very contentious drugs, really. There's a lot of debate amongst professionals about how appropriate some of these drugs are and the effects that they have on young people, which makes it more and more important that we actually get these diagnoses right for these young people, and that we actually eliminate other causes, and we can actually profile what is actually going on for each child before we necessarily have to take it to any stages of medication, which should only really ever be done if that child is in danger of harming themselves or people around them. Going back to the old ADHD argument, there are different types of ADHD. There's the inattentive type, which is where that young person might lose important items, become easily distracted, avoid disliked tasks requiring sustained mental effort, forgetful in their daily activities, they have difficulty sustaining attention in what they're doing, they don't listen, careless, inattentive, they don't follow through, don't complete things, and they can't organise themselves. There is another type which is called the hyperactive, impulsive type of ADHD, where that young person might squirm and fidget a lot, they can't stay seated for very long, run and climb excessively, they can't play, they can't work quietly, constantly on the go. It appears they're driven by some kind of motor that never runs down. They can talk excessively, and they have chronic distraction. They will never allow themselves to engage with what they're doing. So, what do we do then when we have a young person? Of course, these young people are the most disruptive to have around us in terms of doing, meeting their own potential and disrupting the potential of others that are learning around them. And so very often, classrooms and educationalists have a problem in being able to integrate the needs that the ADHD child has along with the needs of the other members of the class. And certain things have to be addressed in order to be able to honour that requirement to meet everybody's needs in a fair way. Impulsivity is a symptom of ADHD, and typically that child blurts out the answers. They can't wait their turn. They intrude and interrupt on others' learning activities, and they're unable to delay their instant gratification. Are we there yet? And some. So you can see from what we've looked at that diagnosis is often a very complicated process. And what does happen a lot is that children will present the symptoms at home and at school, and the questionnaires will be filled in. And when those questionnaires and the tick boxes are complete, a picture picture emerges which shows that those symptoms overlap into a lot of different conditions. And when that actually happens, that young person is said to have complex needs. And this next diagram looks at where all those different categories, because this is what they are, these are just the labels. And in the middle of those labels is a child that needs a lot of support. But when all those labels actually overlap one another, we get this constantly emerging picture of complex needs. Right, this is what we address in HET, and here are some of the helpful approaches that we use in that process. Underpinning most of the things that we do, we try and put a structure in place. Children and young people require structure. They need structure at home, they need structure at school, they need structure in society. And part of that structure is the behavioural expectations and applying the rules and rituals for learning that behaviour. And that should be consistently in place between home and school. And one of the ways of doing that is through rewards and incentives, and these are always far more effective in behaviour management than punishments and sanctions. We look at this in Stepping Stone 2, by the way. And an example I like to use on this, if I came up to you and I took your mobile phone off you and said, right, I'm having that, I'm taking that away from you now, your natural reaction would be, well, hang on a minute, that's not fair, that's not yours, you can't do that. Taking away a child's game console that they had for a present last Christmas is going to get exactly the same response. It's going to increase their level of aggression, their sense of unfairness, and we all know how important fairness is as a child, and you're going to get a greater behavioural reaction from doing that. It is far, far better to focus not on that undesirable behaviour, but how that child can actually improve to give a desirable behaviour through rewards and incentives. So by negotiating with that child, that they're able to show you that desirable behaviour, they will actually get a reward. That could be a controller for their game, or it could be, a new game, whatever. There's always a way of incentivising here. Alongside this, parents and support professionals should always be aware of and be trained as far as possible in identifying and managing non-traditional learning children. Most of the children who are presenting these behavioural issues are not able to cope in traditional learning classrooms. And so what we need to do, and this is what we do in the HET learning journey, of course, is to work with that child, to motivate them, to give them incentives, to create a feeling of enjoyment and success in their learning journey. So they go from becoming learning resistant to actually becoming, well, tell me more, I'm enjoying that. And in order to achieve this, there has to be a foundation in place. There should always be that partnership between parents and school in understanding and agreeing and keeping those behavioural targets, as well as the rewards and consequences that are actually embedded around that. So, the thing to remember here, rewards and incentives are always far more effective in behaviour management, punishments and sanctions. And I know that can be hard sometimes in holding the ground, but it's an important part of having consistent boundaries that takes us to that level. Just gentle reminders about what those incentives are. Very often, after a while, they become practiced. They're the most important part in turning and changing those behaviours. Remember what we said to start off with, behaviours can be changed, behaviour can be taught. This is how we do it. Adapting the environment and the curriculum to the child, rather than making that child fit into the curriculum. This is key. Programs need to be child-focused. They need to be individualised. And HET, of course, does this through our TLC model, therapeutic learning curriculum, with learning guides, parents and carers who work on a daily basis with these young people and encouraging them to make those links with schools, with their learning companions. The professionals support that young person within their traditional learning environment. Adapting that environment, if they're not succeeding in a traditional one, means perhaps being creative about changing those settings. It perhaps means being creative by having a little play tent, which is somewhere to run off to when things get so overwhelming that child can't cope. Very often they've got no place to go and no other strategy to deploy to say, I can't cope with this anymore. There's nothing wrong with having creative environments, by going outside sometimes, by learning out in nature. There is a thing now called nature deficit disorder, which shows that behaviour can be improved when that young person is able to go out and be in green spaces and be in green areas and enjoy being in nature. And we can see improvements from doing that. So there are a lot of things that we can do to make sure that learning environment and the resources around it are available for that young person to learn. If you've got somebody who is constantly wanting to climb and run, then putting them in that environment can be one of the best ways of them learning. I worked with one young man who he was in care, and he came from a background with his dad. He was no longer with his dad, but he would go around and collect scrap metal and recycle. And this young man, when I first knew him, he was totally unapproachable. He would swear, he would curse at you, he would call you every name of the sun, and he refused to be engaged. The way through this young man was when I was outside, or through to this young man, was when I was outside with him. He went and he actually got, it was on a sort of building area where they were doing some extensions, and there's quite a lot of building materials around. And what he did was he went and he started to put together bits of things to make a bicycle ramp, and he wanted to ride his bicycle round it. So what we then got him doing was developing a BMX circuit. Then he was starting to put bikes together, stripping them down, cleaning them off, painting them, putting them back together, doing that for himself and for other students. Then he wanted to make video films around going around this BMX track, and there were huge spin-offs that we could achieve with this young person to engage him in his learning just by adapting the environment and just by hooking in his interest. And this, of course, is the approach we use in therapeutic learning with what we call the learning tree model. Problem solving in specific situations around the child and considering alternative options for management. Find alternative strategies, distractions, interventions to deal with any kind of confrontational situation. And this is what we look at when we call what we call the cycle of crisis. And it's actually observing the behaviours, what those triggers are, what we can do before that person goes into a whole self-destructive cycle of events where they totally lose control, how we can break into that cycle before it actually gets to that extent, and trying different interventions, evaluating what works well. When we find out what works well, then we're able to put that in place as a strategy to actually support that young person that again has to be agreed between home and school. And this is very much a part of the process that we work with within our behavioural programs. It's about keeping the focus in mind of that individual and making that learning program individualised and focused for the needs of that child. Obviously, rapport with children is essential in any learning and socialisation issues. Remember to always speak to that young person as you would like to be spoken to yourself. Always calm down the situation. Keep your temper, because if you don't, it will escalate and you get hooked into that cycle of crisis. It just gets worse and worse and downward spirals. Maintain a compassion for the child. Remember, your job is to observe the behaviour, to understand the behaviour, to be able to give that child the skills and the tools to control that behaviour for themselves. And the most important way you can do that, sincerely, is to have a good sense of humour. So when that young child is going away from you, when it's really going to go down, it's actually going in, taking the confrontation and the conflict away and calming down that situation, reducing the anxiety, increasing their motivation and their confidence and their self-esteem, helping them to increase their concentration, reduce those distractions, importantly, how to increase their own independence. And it's these approaches that work best the child when we're starting to show those behaviours. These successful approaches will always aim to foster positive relationships between children with learning and socialisation issues with their peers, encourage empathy, discuss with them how other people might feel, listening to others. Social storyboards are quite useful here, and you can look at things like the DAISY programs on a HET website, and One of the things that I do in HET is encourage people to be part of the HET PET program, where we've taken people to animal sanctuaries and they learnt how to use the remedies and the approaches and understand the behaviour of animals. Far easier for them to be one step removed so that they can see these behaviours in others, and they will have quite a good understanding of why the dogs or the cats or whatever behave in a certain way. And it almost like entrains their own behaviour in doing that. And by working with the animals, it's encouraging empathy, how that animal might be feeling in that situation, and discussing how that can apply to other people and how you can interact with other people as well. Very powerful way moving this forward. In those communications, it's important to remember that the impact of any communication you have with a child is based on the following. Okay? The impact, 7% of that impact is with the words that you use. 38% of that impact is on the tone that you use, the volume, and the tempo that you say it, the gusto that you say these words with. But by far the biggest impact of any communication is on non-verbal signals, 55% on non-verbal signals. So just that shaking your head, nodding, active listening, maintaining eye contact, just gentle touch, hand on the shoulder, on the arm if you feel comfortable with that. Just that connection so that young person knows that you are actually listening and you do understand. All of us listen to those people that we like and the people that we respect. We like and respect those with whom we can identify or identify with us. And we pay attention to those whom we actually believe mean what they say. Not my words, but Shaw Mistel, 1997. If we listen to those who we like and respect, what do you do to ensure that a child likes and respects you? Remember, we can't control a child's behaviour, we can control our own. How you phrase things to that child or young person is all important. It's the most important factor in deciding the behavioural outcome that you will get. One young man that I was working with, he really didn't want to go off to the animal sanctuary one day, and he was telling me quite emphatically, a young man with oppositional defiance disorder, that he wasn't going to go in no uncertain terms. So the worst thing that you can do with oppositional defiance disorder is to actually say, well, you are going to do this, because as soon as you say you are going to, you can forget it and game over. So the secret to success with this is to not say you're going to do that, but to give that young person a choice. And the way I did that in this situation was this young person was very resistant to writing. And so I gave him a choice, and I told him, and I gave him the least desirable choice for him first. Okay, well, I'm hearing you don't want to go with me, so how about then you stay here and you can then finish off all your folder work that's outstanding while the others go. So your choice is you can stay here and you can do that. You could see him really not wanting to do that and starting to resist about doing that. And then quite quickly you go in and you give the alternative with the incentive attached. Or you can come with the rest of us and have a lovely time at the animal sanctuary today, and then we can stop off on the way back and we can spend some time in the park. Straight away, this young man chose to do the very thing that he was refusing to do to start off with. So it's about developing that rapport and developing those choices that is the key to turning around those behaviours. When that child or young person is speaking to you, one way to stop that situation from escalating is to respond in a way that shows you actually are listening and that you are understanding the situation. At the same time, the expectation that you have is that they will behave in an appropriate way. So the idea is that they understand that you are listening and understanding all the reasons why they're getting wound up, overheated about a certain thing. And you're actually giving them all those non-verbal cues, the nodding, the listening, the, right, I hear what you're saying, you're reaffirming that you're listening. And then you can help them choose which behaviour they're going to go for to most likely get the outcome that they desire. So many adults don't listen, don't show that they're listening and understanding what that situation is. One of the things that you can do is to always find an opportunity to give praise. When you give criticism, it's always counterproductive and you will never improve that situation. Praise is what improves self-esteem, it improves self-reliance, autonomy, achievement and motivation. If somebody starts swearing, behaving inappropriately, you criticise them for doing that swearing, because it's not pleasant to hear and it's not pleasant to see a young person do that. But what you can do is to gently remind them, thank you for remembering at this time when you're feeling very angry not to swear, and then you remind them of any incentive that they might have. Remember, the number of points you get today for not swearing is going to go towards getting in the game or whatever. You're gently reminding them of what that incentive is. That praise can be very general. It can be excellent, well done. It can be, I love the way you put so much time and attention into doing that colouring in. It could be, you are going to be so proud of that when that's finished and it's actually hung on the wall. It can be actually diverting them to, praising somebody else that's showing that same behaviour and ignoring their behaviour, because they're going to want that approval and recognition as well, so they're going to copy the behaviour that's getting the praise. Here now we're going to look at some specific behavioural management approaches to help with some very specific behavioural conditions as they have been diagnosed against the certain traits and characteristics that they have. So when a child, for example, is displaying poor attention skills, what your challenge is to try and work out what are the main things that distract them. When does this happen? For example, does it tend to be worse after the child has eaten or when they've come in from exercise and play? What are the main distractors? Are they sensitive to too much noise? Do they get easily visually distracted? Do they need to move about more to have more social interaction, etc.? And then you work with that. If they need to move about more, then you punctuate their learning. You give them little breaks every 5 minutes where they can actually move around or go and have a bounce on an exercise ball or what have you. And then you incentivise them to come back in and start that learning. So you're actually looking at dealing with the distractions in a positive way rather than in a negative way that's just going to escalate. And that way everyone loses. When a child is perhaps showing an excess of motor activity, they're constantly on the go, allow them to fiddle with an agreed object. That can be anything from, concentrators that you can get, like the exercise balls that I mentioned, bar magnets. It could even be something as simple as a piece of blue tack that they're just allowed to have in their hands to move around. Those squeezy stress balls that you can get, for example, are absolutely great for this. Just allow them to have something to reach for that's going to burn up some of that excess energy that they have. For young people who are on the autistic spectrum, consistent areas are always helpful, and that will need to be at home and at school, where that child can have their own little space. You'll need to ensure that there's always an element of structure and continuity and prepare the child in advance for any changes that are going to happen. So giving them visual cues like dimming the light switch, like giving them countdowns, always really helpful to be able to see what it is that's distracting that child and to combat it. Preempt the behavioural responses that you don't want. Just that little time-out space is so important. You can see them getting stressed out, they're not coping. Just a gentle suggestion that they could go and spend some time in that space can actually diffuse some really heated moments. This point is worth remembering. We are, of course, what we learn. 10% of what we read, 20% of what we hear, 30% of what we see, 50% of both what we see and hear, 70% of what we hear, see and do, but most of all 90% of what we learn is what our peers tell you. great believer in peer mentoring. I've had some wonderful results in that. Also too, what do we remember? We remember things that are outstanding, we remember things that are funny, we remember things that are personal, relevant to ourselves, things that are emotional to us, that make us feel something, things that are linked to our senses, 5 senses, and things that are connected to something personal. That's always an important one. The first and last thing of any learning session. So we remember the last thing of any learning session. So, what is bad teaching? What is bad parenting, apart from being a judgment? Well, perhaps that's an example of one. What do you think? And if that's bad teaching and parenting, what's good teaching and parenting, apart from being a judgment? There are no such things as good and bad in this game of working with behaviour problems. There's trial and error. There's no formula that will always work every time in the same way. It's trial and error. And what we have to do is build it one brick at a time into success.